Hi, this is Dan from Rehydrate. Before we start, I just wanted to make a quick note and apology for my audio in this episode. I had some technical problems and accidentally used my laptop microphone to record the audio from my side. So I hope you'll still listen. It's a great interview with Priya, and thank you again to her very much for joining me. Welcome to the Rehydrate interview series, a forum for discussion of Liu Cixin's Remembrance or His Past series. Each episode, I'll be speaking with a guest about their thoughts and experiences on reading this series. Spoiler warning for listeners, this episode will contain spoilers for all of the Three-Body Problem, The Dark Forest, Death's End, and any other media we happen to discuss. My name is Dan, and today I'm joined by Priya. Welcome.
Hi, Dan.
How are you doing today?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. Let's tell a little bit about yourself.
So I have a background in English literature. That's what I majored in college. And this is actually the first book that I'm reading that I've seriously gotten into in many, many years because life has been getting in the way and I haven't been able to read like I used to, but I randomly picked this up and I couldn't stop reading. I was binge reading. So you're probably familiar with that feeling after you binge read something, you need to talk about it.
Right.
But yeah, literally nobody that I know in real life has read this book. So I was really excited to find your podcast and very happy that you invited me onto it to talk about it because it's this urge that I have to just get my thoughts out there. So thank you.
Totally. I mean, that's almost exactly the reason I started the podcast because I also wanted somebody to talk to you about it. So I just forced my friends into reading it.
Well, that's good. I'm trying to force my husband into reading it now, but he won't pick up the damn book. So I'm well, I need to talk to somebody. So yeah.
Yeah, you said you have an English literature degree?
Yeah, I'm actually currently in between jobs right now because of, COVID and stuff.
Okay.
But also you have to get creative with a degree in English, right? So
Right. So what does that look like? Do you teach or do you write or?
I used to tutor. English writing. Recently I was working for a startup and then things went downhill because of COVID. And then now I'm just trying to get my kid through remote learning. So that's what's up.
Right. Yeah. So how did you find this book?
Where I live, usually people just abandon books in the lobby of the apartment building. So we usually try and pick them up if they look interesting. So it was either my husband or I who randomly found the Three-Body Problem just lying around somewhere in the lobby, and one of us must have picked it up. And it literally sat on the shelf for probably 3 years and no one touched it. And then I was like, I do love sci-fi. I took a sci-fi class in college and I remember that was some of the most fun reading that I did as part of my major. So I was like, okay, this is probably a good place to start because then I know I probably won't quit after a few chapters. So I started and then I was by the time I got to the end, I was like, I'm glad that there are 2 more books and I need to have them immediately. So then the binge reading started. So yeah, that was my intro to the book.
Had you known anything about the book before? I mean, like you said, it sat on your shelf for 3 years, but did you?
No, I actually went into it with zero information based on the back cover, just whatever it said in the back. I knew that there were aliens involved, but from the pacing of book 1 that it's kind of unclear. That there's going to be something to do with aliens when she's the main character becomes a member of what is essentially the Chinese version of SETI.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting. I know that in other episodes of your podcast, you've talked about how the pacing of book 1 is a little bit interesting. It's a little bit weird. And I kind of liked it because it creates more of this feeling of mystery when you know that there's aliens involved somehow, but you don't know quite how. I really enjoyed that aspect of the first book.
Were you thrown at the beginning of the book where they kind of just threw you into the Cultural Revolution? That threw me when I first read it.
Yeah, it did. But I had a feeling that it would probably not stay there, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
and also because it was dealing with like physics,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it seemed like, okay, this is probably telling us something that happened in the past, and it's probably going to progress beyond that in future chapters. But it was really interesting the way that it's set up, like all the groundwork for that.
Definitely, and it pays off like really really well at the end, right? Like you can kind of
Yeah.
see how that formed all of her opinion. And I've said a bunch of times that like I think like Yo and Jay is like probably like the most formed character of all the books. Like I think Liu Cixin is not overall great at writing characters. Like they're mostly just like there to drive the plot forward. But I think Yo and Jay is probably the exception to that. She I think has a very strong character and really strong motivations, and she kind of has an arc. I think looking back on it, I found her character to be the most interesting, and like then especially understanding her background and her trauma from the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, totally. And it's that this is a person who has a history of being scarred by humanity, and you can understand why in the end she decides like humanity's not worth saving, and
Right.
or if, like we need to be replaced, not there's no salvation on the horizon for us. And I remember when I was reading about the part where she's watching all this deforestation taking place, and she's given a book. Then, after reading the book, she comes to the conclusion that there's no way that human beings can fix themselves, basically, that we need something outside of us. And that was the
Mhm.
first moment where I got the sense that, okay, like this is where this is the premise upon which like the alien invasion is going to happen.
You got it way sooner than I did. took me
Well,
way
it's
longer than
because
that.
just knowing that, like, she's looking to some outside force for whatever it is that she finds lacking in humanity. It was a very interesting way to build the foundation for what happens going forward.
And so you said you took a sci-fi class in school. Did it focus a lot? Like, what kind of was it different? Because there's different genres of sci-fi too. There's like hard sci-fi. There's like more character-driven sci-fi.
Yeah.
A bunch of others. Like, so did it focus on any of those kinds, or was it mostly like the classics?
So we did read a bunch of classics. We read some Asimov, but there was also, in my opinion, so like I'm not like a very science-minded person. Like I love science, I do love science, but mathematical science just goes straight over my head.
Mm.
So that's not what I read sci-fi for, obviously. I read it for more of like like I think good sci-fi makes you think about a lot of fundamental truths that about like the world and the nature of human beings. And if sci-fi can get you to really think about those things deeply, I think it's done its job. I think like that's what I look for in a good sci-fi book. I think this book does that. As it moves forward, it does it more and more, I feel. Like you were talking about the character development, I got the sense in the first book, I got the sense that there's just all these random characters, and I'm
Right.
not feeling that much of an attachment to any of them. Ye Wenji just she intrigued me because like she's kind of like the reason for all of this. I honestly didn't feel like her character was that fleshed out later on. Like in the beginning, it sets her up, but then it doesn't build her character too much beyond that. Whereas I feel like the characters that he creates later on, like Luoji and Cheng Xin, those are much more complex characters, I feel. It's almost like in the process of writing, the author is learning that he can do so much more with the characters. And I think that's also where, because I know that a lot of people have said that they have trouble following all the characters because of the names.
Yeah.
Readers who don't have experience with Chinese names. In the beginning, I was struggling with that. But then once the characters started becoming more complex, I found myself struggling with that less. So if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. I think I struggled with that too. I think especially to me, like I think the most stark example is in the beginning of Dark Forest when there's like all these new characters thrown at you at once, and so like there's just like tons of them, and it's hard to keep them straight. But yeah, I think like once they find their voices and they have like motivations that you understand, yeah, especially like the main characters, Ji and Changxin, like I think they are very well defined too. I think that Yuan probably has, like I said before, the biggest arc because like she starts out and she kind of like has doubts. If you remember in the chapters where she goes to the village and then she kind of meets some of the like people in the village and she starts having like, it seems like she's starting having second thoughts about what she did. It's like, well, maybe, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. But then like she goes and visits her mother, and her mother's like, she's living in her tower, and she lies to her about like their relationship, and then she tells her
Right.
husband to go and tell her, don't bring this up, don't bring up your father again, right? and
Yeah.
then she's like, okay, I did the right thing, I got it, like all my doubts are gone. But then she
Yeah.
also has like more doubts later on, like when Evans becomes like a hardcore Adventist, and she's more of a redemptionist, right? I
Yeah,
think there's
that's true.
I think there's more subtlety to her than other ones.
I don't know if I missed this, but I think the reason her whole arc just left me very dissatisfied at the end was because, like, okay, she's done all this stuff. Like, her motivations were kind of understandable for someone in her position. But in the end of it, it's like, what happened? Like, what was her consequence for this? Is it just that she has to live with this now? Or is it that like did she actually face any real consequences at the end of her life, or was it such that like all the consequences that you would expect her to face, because she did kill two people, one of whom was her husband,
Yeah.
and doom all of humanity, no big deal.
Right.
But it seems like in the end it's just that nothing really happened to her.
Yeah, I mean, I got the impression it was like they're just onto bigger things now. Like
Right.
we're in the crisis era now. Like we have bigger things to worry about than you killed some people. Like these Trislanians are coming in 400 years. Like so,
Right, that's
like
true.
yeah. I
That's
mean,
true.
and I think maybe even at the beginning of Dark Forest, she tells Luo Ji about the Dark Forest principle, right, and cosmic sociology. So I think like she does have some reservations about what she did, because
Right.
otherwise she wouldn't have told him. And because of that, he's able to more or less treat the Trisolarians and by using the deterrence thing in the future. So yeah, maybe
Yeah.
that says her way of kind of paying back, the harm that she did cause.
Yeah, that was going to be my question to you, is that do you think that after she actually read what the Trisolarans had planned, do you think that she was like, "Oh crap, what did I do?" Or was it just like did she really think that the Trisolarans were going to be like this benevolent race of being that was going to come in and just create like there's a lot of imagery, by the way, that I found interesting about Eden and the Garden of Eden. Of course, there's like literally the Garden of Eden where Luigi is kind of just living in luxury as a
Right.
wall facer. But then there's also a lot of ideas surrounding the garden in the first book too, where it all begins with Ye Wenji looking at deforestation, which is just like a destruction of Edenic state that the earth was once in. It's almost like she has been painted as a sort of Eve who is the first to receive the knowledge, literally, of the Trisolarans. And then she is the one who ultimately leads to humanity being banished from it. So
Interesting.
I got the sense that like it was just naive to think that only humans are corrupt and that anything that comes from outside of humanity could be pure. And I wonder if she had that, like, was that her thinking, or was she just thinking that anything but humanity would be better for this planet?
I mean, my take was that it was the latter. It's like she saw all the ills, and I think your Garden of Eden thing is definitely appropriate. Like she probably did see like that as like, oh, the human. I think she even mentions it when she's talking to Evans about like how humanity just like destroys all of the nature, right? And so, and what does Evans call himself, like a pan species communist or something?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So humanity is doomed the planet and like beyond redemption. I always saw her as like maybe like in her older age, kind of softening up. I don't think she was necessarily concerned with the Trisolarans coming here and what she got out of the tapes or whatever. She started seeing the reports coming back from the Sophons that the police read to her. Yeah, I guess I thought maybe like in her older age, maybe she's like softening up around the human race, because like they do a lot of chapters where they're talking to her grandkids, or not maybe like grandkids, but other kids in her
Right,
neighborhood.
right, yeah. When she spoke to the grandkids, she seemed like a total, or the little kids, she seemed like a
Yeah.
totally different person.
And then I think she sees Luo as sort of the same mold, because Luo knew her daughter, right? So
Yeah, I was a little bit confused actually about that timeline. Like when exactly her conversation at the beginning of the Dark Forest with Logi takes place. Is it like after all is said and done, like after
Yeah,
the Sophons have already arrived? And it seemed like she basically told Logi about the Dark Forest theory, but perhaps not in a very clear and direct way. Is
yeah.
that what happened? Because I kept wondering, like, what is exactly the connection between Logi and Ye Wenji? Because at the end of the Dark Forest, she must have been significant enough to him that he goes and starts digging his own grave next to her grave.
Hmm.
So it just seemed like it was deliberately like a loose end that was that leaves the reader to just ponder what is their connection. It seemed deeper than just this one conversation that occurred between them.
So I always took it as like the prologue of Dark Forest takes place like shortly after the end of Three Body Problem.
Okay.
Because at the end of Three Body Problem, she sits on the cliff and she says like, "Oh, it's my sunset and sunset humanity," right? In the beginning of Dark Forest, like they talk about her being really old, really frail, and then like she even says like, "I'm not going to have another chance to talk to you again." So I think she knows that like it's the end for her, right? This is sort of like her dying wish to kind of impart this knowledge. And
Right.
yeah, like you said, she doesn't tell him like directly like Dark Forest principle, like everyone's gonna kill each other. But
Right.
she says like, all right, well, gee, you know about the cosmic cosmology or whatever, and then also
Was it
sociology. So,
philosophy or sociology?
sociology, yeah.
Yeah.
So she tells him, yeah, maybe you should study cosmic sociology, put those two things together, right? Because like Luoji kind of like floats around. And I think he even specifically mentions like he knew his daughter, and that's why he was there in the first place to see Yang Dong's grave, right? And then
Yeah.
Ye Wenjie also happened to be there. So I think the connection is there. I don't know if they ever knew each other. I'm not sure if they ever like even met before then. But that was the
Yeah,
connection that I
it
got.
seemed very odd to me that he would go and dig his grave next to hers because it seemed like there was some deeper connection between the two that
Mm.
like is left for the reader to speculate. I just really really love Loji's character.
Mm.
I think he starts off as like such a troll and I'm really curious, what did you think about the whole like fictitious character, like this woman that he created for himself?
Yeah, yeah. It's my least favorite part of the series by far, for sure. Like, when I was like convincing my friends to start doing this podcast, and I knew they hadn't read it, and I was like thinking, I'm like, all right, well, I know book three is awesome. They're gonna love it. Like everyone loves it. It's it's great, right? And then like Death Forest is also really good, like, especially after they make the break, after they go into the future. Like that part is like awesome. But then I was
Right.
like, oh man, they have to go through the part where he's imagining his girlfriend, and then then Dasha has to find his girlfriend that looks exactly like her, and the girl has no agency around her, and she's just kind of like a toy for him to play with, and I don't
I
like
know.
it.
And it's so funny because I think the payoff to all of that is that when he's like having this he's like describing to Dasha that like he wants this woman who looks like this, she's like this, she has this personality. And
Yeah,
then I think Dasha he like draws her for him and
yeah.
he's like, "Oh my gosh, that's her." And he's like, "You're a genius." And he's like, "No, I just know how men think."
Right. Especially men like him, because he spent a bunch of time with Wang Miao, right? And Wang Miao, like in the beginning, is probably very similar because Wang Miao also has like some kind of creepy comments about Yang Dong. He's like took pictures of her secretly and like had him on albums or whatever. So I think like in the beginning, like Luoji and Wang Miao are supposed to be similar. Obviously, Luoji becomes wise beyond his years, and even he becomes like what 200 years old or something. uh,
Yeah.
so he becomes a lot more interesting later, and it is interesting in the beginning, like how he kind of drifts in and out. And I'm right now. I'm like rereading for the podcast, the main podcast, like the very beginning of Dark Forest. And Boji's just like really funny right now because he's like he's accepting that part that he's a wall facer, and then he's like, all right, fine, I'm a wall facer. Give me this gigantic house with like servants or whatever. All right, there's wine at the bottom of the ocean.
Right. That was
Go get
hilarious.
that for me. And they're like, wine. It's like it's part of the plan.
I know that it makes you wonder like what would happen if you picked these like random people that you thought had potential and just gave them free reign over everything, like finances,
Yeah.
just like not worrying about the I mean, of course, everyone's worried about the consequences, but it's such a bizarre situation for like the world to be in, that that all of their hopes rest in these few handful of people, and they have no clue why.
Right. Yeah.
But it really makes you think, to imagine a world where basically the only ideas that are safe are the ones that are inside of your brain, and
Yeah.
the moment it's said, it's ruined.
Right. Yeah. The whole premise, the wall facer, wall breaker premise is super interesting. It's a really interesting take on like, yeah, on sci-fi, and like how the only way to defeat the Trustlands is like not tell anybody, and like have like the secret plan, and then not only like only tell people at the very end. So and then the four different personalities of the wall facers are also like interesting takes on humanity. Like we have the strong man of Ray Diaz, and like the
Right.
intellectual of Hines, and kind of like I guess the coward of Frederick Taylor. Like he's like, or I don't know, he's a coward, but it was like a weird plan to like triple cross. I don't know. It was a very weird plan of his.
But it's funny how like Logi eventually kind of like borrows little elements of other wall facers plans and like kind of
Yeah.
incorporates it into his own execution, which is really just perfect. I was confused about one thing, and I'm wondering if it's like, if you're supposed to be confused about it. Why do the Trisolarans find Luoji to be such a threat? Like, ultimately, like, he proves to be the one who cracks it, but how would they know? It's been established that they're not really good at like strategy.
Yeah.
So how can they recognize someone who can form a good strategy, if that makes sense? And also, the only guess that I had is because the Sophons were there when Ye Wenji spoke to Loji. Do they think that based on that, he must have information that he himself doesn't know that he has?
Yeah, that's totally my guess. Like because that's what I was going to say. Was yeah, like the Sophons are there. I'm obviously like Yewen Jay is a very important person, so the Sophons would have been monitoring her any movement that she has, right? And
Right.
they can move really fast anywhere. So I think she is a person of interest to kind of see that. And so based off of their knowledge that he knows about sociology and astronomy or cosmology or whatever he studied. I think they put it together like, oh, he can figure out the dark, because like she tells him the dark force principles, right? That there's a finite matter, or the finite number of matter in the universe, and I forgot the first one, but anyway, she tells him the axioms of cosmic sociology. And my take was that they figured out that it was dangerous enough where first they order to kill him, right? They try to they tell Mike Evans to kill him, but Mike Evans dies in Operation Kajung. Then they tell the second wall breaker to kill him, and they try with the automobile accident and try to shoot him too. I think they figured out that he knows enough about the dark force principle, and they know how dangerous it is in the world. Because like if you remember in the third book, they talk about like location being like so secretive and like so taboo of information to give up. So they know if like he can both find Tri-Solaris and broadcast it out because he knows about the Dark Force principle, then he's the most dangerous thing to Tri-Solaris. And it turned out to be true, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. I think also in all the assassination attempts on him, there's a lot of comic relief in the latter part of the book where he
Yeah.
wakes up in the future and like just everything is trying to kill him.
Right, yeah. And like I think the sign he like almost falls off like into a hole or something, right? And like a sign falls on him, or like there's like something that falls off of the tree.
Yeah.
And Dodger's always there, like getting him out of the way.
Yeah. And like this unlikely character of Dasha is just like inserted into every situation to kind of like just save the day, like
Yeah.
repeatedly.
Right. Yeah, because he wasn't there, he probably would have died from the initial gunshot, and like he saved him kind of indirectly in the beginning by like being the most competent at his job. Before the Wealth Pacer program was announced, like they're all flying to New York, and they were saying like all the other guys had like, complications, but Dasher's program was like the easiest to execute because it's the simplest. So I think like even the beginning, like he's already saving his life indirectly, and then yeah, with the gunshot and all the other stuff, like it's like a constant stream of Laji being his his own worst enemy and being always in danger by not like paying attention enough, I guess.
It was really fun to read. It's always really fun to read about the way that different people think of the future. Like,
Mm,
what will the future look like? I think like this version of the future, I was like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. Like, just everyone just starts living underground,
right.
and it's just, oh, well, I guess that could work.
Did you see or read Wandering Earth?
What's that?
Oh, it's another short story that the musician wrote, and then it was made into a movie.
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh yeah, it's on Netflix. You should check it out. I mean, it's like a very Leofician kind of premise of the basically like the environment of the Earth is like all it's not habitable anymore. There's some astronomical reason, like it's like going out of the orbit of the sun, or I don't know, something like that. I forget. It's been a while since I saw it, but anyway, like they're all living underground, and like the tunnels like to go to where they live is like really really far down. So it kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, it's always like I find these and I know that a lot of people talk about that show, The Expanse,
Yeah,
when they talk about this book. But like I find these parts the most jarring to read and visualize because it's just the thought of being in this like it just evoked so much like claustrophobia in me. Like just
yeah,
people in spaceships just like hurtling into space forever and ever, and it's
yeah.
all darkness all around, no sunlight, never no sky. So it's just it also speaks to how all of these like fake environments that they create, like even later on in Death's End, where they basically just colonize outer space, and like every single place has to have some sort of resemblance to what life on Earth looked like. It just makes you think about how there's something just so organic in humans where we like need, you know how like if you don't put a plant in sunlight it's going to wilt. It seems like humans also need that sunlight, just, you know, and not just physically but like psychologically.
Right.
And it's fascinating to see the effects mentally and physically on people like in the expanse when they're not exposed to some very very basic conditions that you don't even normally think about on Earth.
Yeah, I think even in the underground cities, they were talking about how they have like a fake sky. I think Village U was even confused when we first got there. That
Yeah.
yeah,
Like they
this,
have to have a fake sky. You can't just
right,
be like you can't just not have a sky.
yeah, yeah. That always remind me of I don't know if you've been to Las Vegas and like the Paris casino. They have like the ceiling is painted like a sky. It looks like you're outside and in like in these pavilions like gambling. So that was reminding me of that.
Oh yeah, I have been to Vegas, but I don't know if I've been to that exact casino.
But when you think about the series in general, like what are the parts that really stick out to you that like you would consider your favorite parts of the series? Because it's hard. I think it's hard to pick a favorite book. I had to do it to pick Death's End because it's awesome. I mean, they're all awesome, but Death's End is like especially awesome to me. But like, I guess like what parts would you consider to be your favorite?
I think like if I had to start with one that really and let's get the least favorite out of the way. Hoji's made up girlfriend.
Sure.
Um I agree with you, like that wasn't the best
Yeah.
of the writing. But I think there are some, so I was a big fan of Murakami. I'm a big fan of magical realism. And I think this book actually has a few moments in it that feel kind of like magical realism. One of them that comes closest to that is the conversation with the ring,
Hmm.
which kind of just like blew my mind. It was like it just seemed so like fantastical, but at the same time, in the form of metaphor, it made so much sense. I know that it's supposed to be a very nonsensical conversation, but it just seemed to make a lot of sense. And what really fascinated me about the conversation with the ring is that the ring seemed to speak in metaphors,
Yeah.
and it seemed like such a contrast from the Trisolarans who don't understand metaphors. It's almost like, how do you gauge the intelligence of a species or a sentient being? Is it through like being through having like a command of like, you know, just science and physics and just understanding the natural world? Or is it to be able to think on a more elevated level and to speak in metaphors with another sentient being that you've never probably encountered in your life before.
Yeah, and in a language that like they just learned, right? Because like they were talking about how they uploaded the language to them, and they was able to decode it really fast and send them messages.
And see that what's fascinating about that to me is that like what fascinated me is not how quickly the ring learned the language and was able to transmit, to have hold a conversation, but the fact that it could speak in metaphor.
Right. Yeah, actually, you had mentioned this off air, and I was looking through those chapters again, and I pulled out some of the quotes that I think that you're talking about. So, like one of the ones that was really interesting to me was it says the fish responsible for drying the sea are not here. We're sorry, what you said is really hard to understand. The fish who dried the sea went onto land before they did this, and moved from one dark forest to another dark forest. It's very deep, and it kind of fits into the fairy tales, like how they talk about, because like they talk about it as like bubbles, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's very metaphorical, and yeah, they pick, like you said, they picked it up really fast out of just knowing, like they called it the Rosetta Stone, right? And so like
yeah,
I doubt the Rosetta Stone like had like a way to construct metaphor, so
right.
but maybe it's because like maybe is what he's trying to say is like because they're four-dimensional creatures, they can kind of also see through meaning that way. Maybe that's how he's trying to construct
that's
it.
so interesting to almost like see like ideas in multiple dimensions. That's a really nice thought.
Yeah, because you mentioned like what constitutes intelligence, right? So like these creatures, like were they always four-dimensional? Did they become four-dimensional because of their higher intelligence, or maybe like they're less intelligent because there's even higher dimensional creatures out there, right? So it's hard to know, but like they're definitely more intelligent seeming to us because they can manipulate and traverse four dimensions kind of natively.
And the even more interesting thing is that there isn't even a living being within the ring. It's that
right.
it's that it's a tomb. It's like whatever it is just like a program speaking to them that's supposed to, I guess, echo the voices of whoever created it.
Right.
The line that stood out to me the most actually is that when I think it was Guan Yifan who asked the ring, did you create this fragment of the four-dimensional fragment, and it returns his question with another question, which is, you said you came from the sea, did you create the sea? That immediately made me think of one of the earlier chapters in the book where Yang Dong, is that her name? Ye Wenji's daughter, is talking to one of the guys in the lab, and she asks him this random question, do you believe in God? And he's like, no. And then he shows her this simulation that shows that if life didn't exist, then like the earth probably wouldn't even have water on it. Whereas like your mind thinks that life exists because the earth has water on it. For some reason, that line got me thinking about that, where, the ring asks, did you create the sea? And in a sense, it seems like the answer to that could be yes. Like if that theory is true, that the earth would not even be the earth that we know if humans or if all of life never had existed, then yeah, probably like whatever organism exists within a space kind of also creates that space, right?
Yeah, like more of a symbiotic relationship between the planet and the species, right?
Right. And it really speaks to that. And it was such a loaded question. And I was like, this is the kind of stuff I want to read. And then there is also another moment, I think, that's so beautifully written, which is when Luoji, when it all suddenly clicks for him. And he has this like, and I think it's so, I think it's one of his one of the author's better pieces of writing in the book, where he just has all this imagery describing looking up at the stars. Okay, I'm going to read this quote, which is, I just thought it was just so beautifully written. At the precise instant the icy water covered Luoji's head, he saw the stillness of the stars shatter. The star field curled up into a vortex and scattered into turbulent, chaotic waves of silver. The biting cold, like crystal lightning, shot into the fog of his consciousness, illuminating everything. He continued to sink. The turbulent stars overhead shrank into a fuzzy halo at the break in the ice above his head, leaving nothing but cold, inky blackness surrounding him, as if he weren't sinking into ice water, but had jumped into the blackness of space. In the dead, lonely, cold blackness, he saw the truth of the universe. It's just like this totally sublime moment where you can imagine this guy in like total darkness, just looking up at the stars, and it all just clicks. And then later on, it says that, after that, he developed the same phobia of the stars that was it Ray Diaz had developed of the sun.
Yeah.
And it was just like, and then how it all ends with like him saying to himself, "I am your wall breaker," which is just such great writing. And I like when this is adapted into a show, like I would really love to see that moment well done.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, there's a lot of like kind of internal dialogue there, right? So, like, how do you show that on? Like, that's always a problem with adapting books to film or to TV.
I know
or whatever, right?
a lot of stuff gets lost in
Yeah,
in the port in just visual versus reading, which is also like the nice thing about reading is that it's not instant gratification like it is when you're watching something.
yeah.
There's so much buildup to moments like these. Another conversation that you and I had like outside of this was about Cheng Xin and
Mhm.
how like initially I was like, I hate her. But like the more I thought about it, and this was just like my knee-jerk instant reaction after I finished reading the book, and I was like, oh, she screwed everyone over. But then in the end, there's this like beautiful moment where Guan Yifan tells her it's not wrong to choose love. That's another moment that'll probably like stay with me, where he kind of just tells her this thing that she needed to hear so badly.
Hmm.
And I think like any human put in a position like that would need to hear. And he also goes further and says that it can't be any single person that dooms all of humanity. It's a collective, it's a bunch of like collective decisions made by humanity as a whole.
Right.
And I think that's kind of like the entire theme, I would say, of all the books.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like more inevitable that the events would have happened eventually. Maybe they wouldn't happen that soon, but like in the cosmic scale of things, like they happen really fast, right? Because
Right.
like the universe lasts for billions and billions of years, and within what 400 years or whatever it was between the first contact between the Trisolarans and the universe being kind of folded into two dimensions, it was really fast in the scheme of things. So that probably would have happened eventually. Like, yeah, Singer would have seen the star somehow. Like, there's no way like that wouldn't eventually happen. The rest of the universe is already fighting over resources, especially with like the axiom that there's like only a finite number of resources in the universe. So it was only a matter of time before someone found our civilization. And that probably, given the advanced state of the other civilizations, we probably wouldn't have gotten to that point. Maybe we had, but who knows?
There's nothing like being exiled to Australia to make you think about the finite nature of resources.
Right, yeah.
And I found that I've actually lived in Australia for a few months, and it really, like when they said that everyone's being resettled to Australia, like I really like couldn't help but laugh, because it's like I know the country and it's so sparsely populated, because you really can't live in the middle of Australia. You have to live along the coast. Most, like 70% of it is just dry and barren.
Yeah.
And if you want to go further with that metaphor of this loss of Eden, exile to Australia works really well. Not that Australia doesn't have like beautiful like landscapes and like even forests and all of that stuff, but like when you go inland, all of that starts to disappear.
Yeah, Australia in general I mean, I have not been there, but I mean, yeah, in my mind's eye, it has like, yeah, really beautiful coasts, and the inland is really harsh and really dangerous.
Right. Yeah. It's a very harsh climate. And so it's
Yeah,
like, it's so fitting that like the Trisolarans would be like, we'll get all of Earth. You guys can have Australia.
right.
So what did you think about the Trisolarans never being described? like physiology.
I was okay with it. Yeah, like like sometimes there'll be movies or shows or whatever that will show the alien. I'm thinking of like Signs, when it's like the aliens are so mysterious and like scary, and it kind of gets you thinking. And then you see them, it's like, oh, all right, that's not a big deal. So yeah, I think it was fine. I think it's even more interesting that he told us a story from their perspective. Like the chapters at the end of Three Body Problem,
Right.
without actually physically or not describing them that much. Like they talk about like how they communicate and how they have their family structures and their job structures and like their political structures, but like not actually what they physically look like, because it's probably not important, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking it's not important. And then I like anything that remains unexplained, even if I agree with it remaining unexplained, will bug me. So I went ahead and I read Bao Shou's book, which is basically a bunch of fan fiction. And the one part of that book I did find interesting was that because the other huge loose end for me was Yun Tianming. So I read that book because it also kind of explains what it tries to explain, rather what must have happened to him while his brain was taken by the Trisolarans.
Hmm.
And one of the interesting things that I found from reading that is that there is a description of the Trisolarans, and it's that they actually are bugs. They're like
Oh,
little
really?
tiny little creatures that are the size of like a grain of rice.
Oh, really?
And so in it, like Yun Tianming, once he's like cloned and he wakes up and he's like, oh, why are there no Trisolarans around me? Like, where are they all? Maybe they don't want to show me their, what they look like, because I will be like terrified of their alien appearance.
Hmm.
And then later on, he comes to find out that they've been all around him all this time. He just hasn't noticed them because they're so tiny.
Oh.
And then at first I was like, no, I don't like that description because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, how could they create these like enormous, vast structures when they're so tiny? But then it got into like talking about how they don't think as individuals. Like, so if you take like any one Trisolaran individual, it would be like really dumb. The way they function is like as a collective unit of many, many, many individuals, and that forms intelligence, which
Hmm.
I found really interesting because we're so used to thinking of intelligence as like the accomplishment of individual human beings versus like imagine if like every single person was not very smart, but then if you take like 100 people and put them together and you can literally put their brains together and then they're smarter. So that part really stood out to me. And then I of course got thinking about how they at the end of Three Body Problem they say they transmit a message to all humans, you're bugs.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, that would make sense because it's sort of like they're saying, we're not bugs, you're bugs. So then it all was like, okay, I'm okay with that possible description of the Trisolarans.
Hmm. Yeah, I never would have considered that. I think I always assumed like they're kind of big blobby creatures. Like I
Yeah,
always
me
assumed
too.
like
I
they're
would have never thought of them as like these tiny little critters, but then that also makes sense why they would want all of humanity to like just go away
yeah.
because they'd probably be afraid of humans who are to them essentially giants.
Yeah, so I wonder, like, I don't know how, I know, like you had said, it's fan fiction and people describe it as such. Like, I wonder if, like, that is what's in Louis Succin's mind, or if he's even, like, made any comments about it. I'm not sure that he has.
I don't think so, but like all I know about the book is that he read it and he liked it.
Oh,
But then
really?
I will also say that the second half of that book it just got too out of hand. Like
Hmm.
it's like he bit off more than he could chew.
Oh, yeah.
And then it just turned into like a whole like it turned into like its own like creation myth sort of thing. But then there was another interesting part of it that was like, do you remember when Cheng Xin wakes up in like this new world where there's like Trisolaran art?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the book tries to explain that that's not actually Trisolaran art, but it's stuff that they found while picking Yun Tianming's brain. So yeah, that was one interesting explanation for that. So those were the only two things I liked from the book.
Okay. So would you recommend people read it or
um,
just read the summary? Or listen
I
to
would
this.
say read if you're interested, like I was, in reading more about like what could have happened for Yun Tianming. Maybe read half of it and then just discard the other half,
Hmm.
which is kind of hard to do. But like,
Yeah.
there came a point in the book where I wasn't gaining anything of much value from it, and it also was interesting to compare the writing style to Liu Cixin. He's a much more like mature writer than Bao Shu, and it really shows. Like there's a lot of dialogue in the Redemption of Time that's like very cringy. So I had to
Mm.
like really get through some of that. But it's good because like I feel like that was a huge like loose end, and I mean it was supposed to be like, no, you're not supposed to really focus on Yun Tianming beyond his fairy tales. But yeah, it's nice to think of like what happened to a character behind the scenes almost, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
So read 50% of it.
So you had mentioned earlier that like it seems like when you talk about like Luoji's kind of revelation, where it's more like more literary, yeah, those are more of your favorite parts. But there are also various very scientific parts of the books. You know, I'm thinking of like Project Sophon parts or the parts where they describe in technical readouts of how actually like Ye Wenjie sent her communication to the sun and like talks about like the physics of it and like there's a lot of like really hardcore like science stuff. Like, how did that stuff strike you?
I do enjoy when like concepts like that are written out. It's all about the prose for me. So
Hmm.
like even if someone is describing like a scientific fact, but it's like written in a certain way, like I won't understand it, like the technicalities of it, but like I can appreciate it. You know, like for instance, like I really am terrible at math, but I can admire someone who is so good at math, like that they see the beauty in math. I think that's also how like one of the characters in Three Body Problem is described, that he just saw numbers differently. Like they formed like these elaborate like patterns and stuff for him.
Oh yeah, I forgot
Um
his name. It was Shen Yufei's husband, the guy who
yeah.
figures out the three body.
Yeah, that was one of the characters that was like not significant enough for the name to to remain with me, but the way he described like these mathematical concepts was like I really admire people like that who can really see the beauty in these like cold hard equations, which I can't see. So it's almost like something that's like out of my grasp, that I'm just like barely touching the surface of, and just like, you know, it's almost like a work of art to admire from afar. The parts that I found the hardest to read, which is probably not going to be a popular opinion, but it was like Zhang Beihai's parts were really hard for me to read.
I get that, especially in the beginning when it's just like just a bunch of military people talking about military stuff. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that's exactly why.
Yeah, I think the thing I didn't appreciate when I first read it, or maybe even on like subsequent readings, is like someone described him as the fifth wall facer, which I think is a really interesting way to describe him, in that
Right.
he from the beginning had a plan of escaping, right? But like he couched it in like that he's actually a triumphalist the whole time, right? He's like saying, "Oh, we can do it. We can beat the Trisolarians. I'm the only one who believes we can do it. We can make high tech ships. We can do all this stuff." Like he kills a scientist because like they're developing old technology, and you really think like he is the only one who like has like a plan to defeat the Trisolarians. But he does a 180 on you. Like he's like the only person who's like understands that we need to get out of the solar system and get away from the Trisolarians for the human race to actually survive. And he's right? Like that's the only way
Yeah.
we that the human race did survive is by having those ships get out of the solar system and build those generational ships.
I found that really interesting in the context of how they describe these ideas of like defeatism, escapism is like all things like you don't want to do. And it repeatedly forces you to think in a sense about like what is it that tethers a person to their humanity? Is it that you're going to put duty above all else? And what exactly is your duty towards? Like, is it towards all of humanity? Is it towards like a certain set of virtues that define humanity? And it's also interesting because once you're flung far out into space, all of those virtues and those ideals start to break down. And it makes you wonder, like, okay, well, is it that you actually have to have a tether to the earth to be able to hold on to your humanity? And then in the end, you see Guan Yifan, who has been like kind of like wandering through space for so long. And he was there for a lot of these, really horrific events that happen on the ship. And you see that he still has his humanity. He's able to comfort Cheng Xin, who's like seen as the epitome of humanity. He's able to comfort her and tell her, you did the right thing. It's kind of like, it really makes you wonder, like, is this militaristic sense of duty just one aspect of clinging to one's humanity? Or like, it's just, it gets all these ideas in your mind about like, what would a human do if they were flung far out into space, right?
Yeah, I think the interesting part is that like he has all these different personalities, of the different kind of facets of the human perspective on things, and like in those situations, you have Cheng Xin, you have Ji, you have Wade, you have Zhang Beihai, you have like all these different ways that people, and even like in the beginning, like Ye Wenjie like has like different perspective about humanity's role in the ETO, and yeah, there's like just tons of different perspectives about how humanity would respond to both the crisis and of knowing that there's an alien race coming to invade us, or knowing that we'd have to get out of there, and how we would survive long term, and what are the important things, and like what are the necessary things for us to survive long term.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting how there are these multiple periods in the books where, especially during the deterrence era, where people fall into this false sense of like, this, they fall into like this lull that like, oh, everything's going to be fine. The Trisolarans are sending us art, and
Right.
everything's going to be fine. We're okay. And this is the other mark of like good sci-fi to me, is that no matter when you read it, it resonates as relevant to like current events. I find that, isn't this how we treat global warming?
Right.
We know that it's going to come for us, but
right.
it's a threat that's not close enough.
Right.
So we don't worry about it. I had read something about how like, humans perceive risk and like threats, that if it doesn't trigger your flight or fight response, it's usually something that, even if it's a certainty, it's like a bit abstract, or it's like a bit far out there, that you're like, oh, it doesn't concern my now, so I'm not really going to worry about it.
Right. Yeah. Actually, one of my co-hosts, Tim, brought up that same perspective. Like he was thinking, like when the crisis era first started, we don't see that in the books. Like, or we read about it. Like we start 3 years in, so it's probably like mass freak out, right? In like the first like couple months, right? And especially if you think about our 24-hour news cycle and like events coming so fast, like
right,
like people buy, like there's a mass freak out, probably like all these crazy stuff happened, but then like people realize like, oh, it's 400 years away. Like, like the there's so much stuff that can happen. It's not going to happen to me. It's going to happen to my grandkids, grandkids, right? Like, it happen like way down the line. So yeah, and you can kind of see that, I think, when they start getting their false sense of security, like when the Legio wakes up in the future, and they're like, oh, humanity is great now. We advanced so much in 200 years. We can take care of like one little droplet. It's no problem.
Right, totally. And it's not even like threats that are like as far out into the future as global warming. We even behave that way towards threats that are like in the near future, if they're not a 100% certainty, like COVID.
Right. Yeah.
We were so like, it's in China, it's not coming here, and sure enough, it came here.
Right.
And that's when it's almost like this reactionary mindset versus like preventive mindset.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's just like a part of our culture, right? There's like too many problems to think about, and you kind of focus on like what's in front of you at the time. And if something seems like it's far out, or it's like not probable, or like it won't impact you, right? Then maybe you won't take it as seriously. Maybe you should.
Yeah, which is why it's interesting to explore like all these different, almost like schools of thought that form around this subject. Like, there are some people who are like, oh, this is exactly why humanity doesn't deserve to like, survive.
Yeah.
And then there are like people who are like, oh, like we're doomed anyway, so why bother? And then there's escapists who are like, well, we need to figure out a way to get out of here. And that's also seen as being like anti in the best interests of the people. So when Kwan Yifan talks in the end about how like it's not any one single person who doomed us all, it's kind of like, yeah, it's all these like conflicting ideologies. And that's why it also interested me about like this collective intelligence versus individualistic intelligence, because I've often like, especially within the scope of like the pandemic and stuff, I felt that we as people are especially some countries have this kind of culture more than other countries. We're like very individualistic, and
Right.
and it somehow often functions against the best interests of all of humanity when everyone is thinking as an individual. It's kind of like how those spaceships just start taking off by themselves.
Yeah.
And not caring about how they're just like incinerating everyone else in their wake.
Yeah, exactly.
And then AA has this idea that she's just going to disable all the ships so nobody can take off now. And it's like, it's really, you see those two modes of thinking really clash with each other in that moment, where it's like, if you're going to think about yourself as an individual, you're going to screw everyone else over. So how about like we disable everybody? And like, if we have to die, we die together. And it's like such a different way of thinking than what we're accustomed to. I felt like there was one moment where like there's sometimes like you can tell that the author is speaking and not just the narrator, right? Like I felt like his whole commentary on like masculinity and manliness, I felt like that was all Sijin. Like that was all him.
Yeah.
I really felt that because it seemed so kind of like out of place almost. Where like Chengxin wakes up and then she notices that all the men look like women.
Right.
And then there's this whole like dialogue that follows where it's almost like the author is kind of giving away what he really thinks. She like almost has like this moment where she like laments. She's like, how am I going to live in this feminine world?
Right. It's
where
like, yeah,
masculinity has been erased.
And I think she sees like, doesn't she like start seeing like Wade as kind of attractive because he's not feminized?
Yeah, but then also later on, he kind of like points out that like whenever she sees a man from the common era, he's usually presenting like ideas that make more sense. And he's also more manly looking. And I really think like, of course, like you can find sexism in the books. And I think that the books kind of like almost like transcend all of that. Like that's not what the books are about. But I found that one particular bit really interesting because then it kind of took me out of it and got me thinking about like, okay, yeah, he has written all these characters. And of course, Chengxin is like a strong female character, but she's also the one who's more of a sentimentalist. Right. Versus Loji and a lot of the men who are more like of the strategists and they're more logical versus the women who are kind of like, Ye Wenji. Even it's not even a matter of intelligence. Like the women are all extremely intelligent and competent. Right. But they're always falling victim to this sentimentality that the men don't seem to be as affected by. Did you notice that?
No, definitely. Yeah, for sure. So I know you also wanted to talk about some other material that you thought was similar to these books. I'm thinking specifically of, you had mentioned the cold equations and To Serve Man.
Yeah. So these were two short stories that I read when I was in my sci-fi class. And also I'm going to name drop another book that kind of like was so profound to me at the time. It totally like informed a lot of my perspective. And I don't know if I can spoil these.
Go for it. I said at the beginning, we can spoil all media we talk about. So
the first one is the cold equations, which is basically about, there's a ship that's like, it's almost like a cargo ship out in space. It's carrying a certain amount of cargo with a certain amount of fuel. It finds that there's a stowaway. It's this girl who's like a teenage girl trying to reunite, I think, with her brother, or a family member of hers who has gone out into space, whatever their destination planet is. It's been a while since I read this. And she thinks like she's going to hide away on the ship and she's going to arrive at this location and surprise her brother, who she hasn't seen in forever. The pilot of the ship realizes that there's no way that the ship is going to make it to the destination because the amount of fuel in the ship is finite and it hasn't accounted for the additional mass of this girl. So the rest of the book focuses on what to do with the girl. Like, you have to get from point A to point B, and you cannot get to point B or back to point A with this girl in tow. It's just like this heart-wrenching exchange that takes place between the pilot and the girl, where he has to tell her that I'm going to need to basically eject you from the ship because we're not going to make it.
Yeah.
And that's why it's called the cold equations, because and what got me thinking about this story is that I think there's a quote in Death's End where they say it takes 5 minutes once you're cast out into space for humanity to turn to totalitarianism. It's like when I was talking earlier about like what tethers you to your humanity, and ultimately when you're out there in space, it comes down to these cold hard equations where you see it in like the three ships that have to basically face the prospect of annihilating each other to collect fuel, basically. So it was just like this, when we as a human species or a race, we talk about like, how great would it be to colonize Mars? How great would it be to like go out there and colonize space?
Right.
I think these are really like cautionary tales about like, what would that do to our humanity to go that far out there?
Yeah, people have sort of grand ideas of like how we explored the Earth. It's like ingrained in our history, like, well, we had these great explorers and they colonized these lands, and so people kind of attribute that to space too, without thinking of all the perils that those explorers had to go through too, right? Like people got scurvy and died on these boats, right? And so like what happens when they apply that to space when like there's no possible way for any kind of rescue, or even like currently with space travel, right? Like, you think about like Apollo 13, like if those astronauts hadn't been able to get back, they would just be floating in space forever, right? And then you apply that to going to Mars or going, even further out there. It's not safe. So I thought the story was, I hadn't heard the story before you had mentioned it to me before. So I did read it, and super sad. Like I didn't.
I know it's one of the really, really sad ones, and it's I think a lot of these really deep and thoughtful works of sci-fi, I think a lot of them, what they do is they make you think about like, they make you think that, okay, science is great, but there's also like, there are aspects of like human curiosity that don't lead to a good end.
Yeah.
And like not all of it is like, we don't need to conquer every frontier. If you choose to do that, then you do risk losing some of your humanity in the process. Yeah. And then the next short story that I brought up was To Serve Man, which is basically like what happened with the Trisolarans, which is there's this the short story is set in a world where aliens have made contact, they've arrived, and there's this text that they have that humans are hard at work trying to decipher. It's called To Serve Man, and the aliens keep telling the humans, we're here to serve you, we're here to serve you, and they start making everything better. Like they make all of these like bad conditions on Earth just get better. And then like the scientists or like the linguists who have been hard at work trying to translate this text, ultimately the ending of it is that To Serve Man is actually a cookbook. I think a lot of people might be familiar with the story because I think it was a Twilight Zone episode a long time ago.
Yeah, actually, I watched it afterwards too. Yeah, and it's also from The Simpsons. The Simpsons has a similar gag. I don't know if I got it from this story or from the Twilight Zone, but they have it.
I haven't seen any of those, but like I've only read the story. But then it was like, oh well, like duh, like they're not making things better for us. to, serve us. They're literally trying to serve us to them.
Yeah. Yeah, the Simpsons has a great gag around it where like they have like this book where it says like where Lisa finds the book and it says like how to cook humans, and she's like, oh my god, how to cook humans, and like they blow off the dust and it's like, oh, how to cook for humans, and they blow off the dust again, it's like, oh, how to cook for humans. So it's like they go back and forth.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. Yeah, but it's just like this chilling thing that makes you think like, why do we think that it's such a great thing to have contact with another intelligent civilization from outer space? Like, why do we think that that's great? Like, we don't
Right.
know we don't know their values. We don't know like what their level of sentimentality is and how it would match up against ours, or how like we think that it's bad to kill other people. But do they think that it's bad to kill an entire civilization? Like, maybe not.
Right.
So, like, and of course, like, what's particularly chilling is that with the Trisolarans are also coming from a place where their existing home, their existing planet is like not very great. It's like,
Yeah, it's on the brink of falling into the sun.
every few civilizations just get incinerated by one of the suns.
Yeah.
So it's like, why not? Why not go and conquer another planet? I mean, humans have done that over history. Like, we've conquered other peoples for the sake of, making things better for our country, or like whatever the countries were at the time.
Yeah.
So it's like, why not? And so it made me think, like, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, it would be so cool to find signs of life somewhere else in the universe. But then I'm like, actually, maybe we're good. And then the final book that I really wanted to bring up was, it's more of an obscure book. I don't know if like a lot of people have read it, but it's called A Canticle for Leibowitz. It is by Walter Miller Jr. And it's a book that takes place in a post-apocalyptic world that's been destroyed by nuclear warfare. And humans basically just revert back to a very, very, very primitive way of life. So basically, back when religion was everything. And religion kind of also informed our understanding of the natural world. They go back to that. They basically they either burn or hide away all of the science texts, because they're of course seeing science now as the enemy. That was the cause of our destruction. So, and of course, these humans who survived survived by being in underground bunkers. Always go underground. So yeah, they come out and they decide science is bad. We're going to go back to a very antiquated form of civilization. And then the rest of the book traces the path that humanity takes from there, knowing that science leads to bad places. And the question that it asks is, if we could do it all over again, would we do it differently, or would we do the exact same thing? I think that was one of my first experiences with sci-fi that really, really, really got to the heart of what it is to be a human being versus just like all these scientific discoveries. And like a good contrast to these types of books is The Martian, which is like, it really revels in its ability to calculate all these things, like how the exact calculations for how you can grow potatoes on Mars, like it will really indulge in that. But what books like the Three Body trilogy and also A Canticle for Leibowitz really kind of indulge themselves in is asking these bigger questions of like, if we were to explain this aspect, or if we were to conquer this aspect of the natural world, what would that do to our basic sense of humanity?
It's really interesting. I'll make sure to put that book in the show notes. Is that book is pretty old?
It was published in 1959. I think it's interesting because around that time, 1959, when this was written, sci-fi from that time really seemed to focus a lot on the the imminent threat of nuclear disasters.
Right.
And more modern sci-fi seems to be more focused, at least to me, on like space exploration, because like, so we're so on the cusp of it. Yeah, and whenever it's always like a cautionary tale, right? Even when you read about sci-fi that has to do with like artificial intelligence, it's always about like, well, let's be careful how far we tread into this direction.
Finally, I want to talk about the TV show that's coming up. What are your thoughts around that? Like are you excited about it? Apprehensive about it? I guess what are
There
your
there
feelings there?
isn't a date yet, right? Like a tentative date.
Not that I've heard.
No, me neither. I think I just, I have a bit of a caveat, which is that like I really would hope that Weiss and Benioff are like really refreshed after their whole experience doing Game of Thrones, because it really seemed by the end, the final season of Game of Thrones, they really just got tired of doing this thing.
Yeah, definitely.
So as long as they don't do that to this, I think it's really fitting that they should be the ones to take this on, because I feel like they're just masters at, creating. Well, they didn't create the plot lines, but or at least all of them, but they're good at building up that feeling in you that you're getting really attached to a character, you're getting really into this, you're thinking that this person or this family is going in, good things are about to happen to them, and then suddenly someone's head gets chopped off.
Right.
And I feel like I got a similar feeling when I was reading these books, where it was like, oh, like, during Deterrence era, I also fell into a sense of like a lull, like, oh, this is so nice. Like the Trisolarans are giving us art, and maybe a new faction has taken over, and they decided maybe they might come and live in harmony with humans, and they might want to share the earth with us. And
Right.
like, I can see why people would think that way.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's like a complete fall from the edge of that cliff.
Yeah.
So I think they're really good at translating these types of storylines to screen. So I'm really excited that they're the ones behind it. So I'm really excited to see it. Like I'm not like a book purist, if that even makes sense. Like I'll watch the show, I'll watch the movie, and I will look forward to it too. But I feel like a lot of times as a reader of the book, you always feel like, the book did that so much better, and
Right.
they just like failed at this one thing. The good thing with Game of Thrones for me was that I didn't read the books, because I tried to. I think it always ruins it for you if you start watching the show first, because your brain gets like trained to anticipate like this instant gratification that I was talking about earlier. And then the book requires you to read through just like many, many, many pages of like George R.R. Martin describing like a banquet.
Right. Lots of food.
Lots of food. I know. He seems to love describing the food. So I couldn't get through that, especially knowing how many books there are to go with like probably several banquet scenes. And then later on, the fact that he has not yet finished, that kind of ruined it for me. But that's why I'm really glad I read the books first in this case.
When I read it, I actually watched the first season before I read the books, and then after the first season, I went through and read the rest of the books that were out there. Only because like I'm so afraid of spoilers, and because it was becoming a popular show, especially amongst my friends, like I didn't want to be spoiled on anything. And I figured like if I read the books, then I would avoid all those spoilers. So that's, yeah. I thought
because you like already spoiled it for yourself by
right. Yeah. Cause I'll know what happens. And like, and so I don't know, I'm really weird about spoilers that way.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. Like there's this one podcaster that my husband and I listen to, and he will not even like when he watches, like when you go to watch a movie back in the pre-COVID days when things like that happened. And the trailers came on, he would like close his eyes and close his ears because he didn't want to be spoiled by trailers. So I totally get it.
I did that with only with like Star Wars movies. I would do that. Like I would like not watch like the new Star Wars movies came out. I didn't watch any of the trailers or anything. Like, and especially like
it's nice going in knowing nothing sometimes.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
Especially with these books. Like I went into it knowing nothing but aliens, and
yeah,
that was fun.
I didn't even know, but when I first the first day I listened to the audiobook for Three Body Problem. I didn't know anything about it other than it was quote unquote hard sci-fi. I didn't know there's aliens coming or anything. So yeah, it was really
Well,
nice to have. Yeah.
I think there was also this something that was a little bit misleading. I think it was a review at the in the back of the book, which was like, if you like computers, read this book. And I was like, I don't like computers, but I'm gonna read this book.
That's probably from the human computer part. So yeah, and I do like computers. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was fun for those who do like computers too, but I feel like, it doesn't alienate anybody who's not particularly liking computers.
totally. But like as so me personally, I'm I study computer science and I do programming for a living. So like the part in the first book when they describe the human computer, like that's one of the big parts. Like so when I think of like big moments for me, that's one of them. Because like it's like, oh, that's my world. I get that. Like they're making computers.
What exactly are you referring to? Are you referring to like the Sophons or?
No, remember when they're in the three body world, they have the big army with all the flags going up and down, and like they're making like
Oh
the human
yes,
computer.
yes, yes. See,
Yeah, yeah,
that stuff went right over my head.
yeah, yeah.
I was like,
So
what are they even talking about? Like, what are they doing? And
yeah.
what was that supposed to be like a metaphor for what they did with the Sophons?
No, not really. It's just
Was
like
it not unrelated?
it's I don't think it's a metaphor, but it's just like showing like an interesting way of technology and how their civilization works by because like normally so in like a computer architecture you'll have like ones and zeros, right? And those are like denoted with like electricity or no electricity, right? So that's how they like have the flag going up. That means electricity. It's like one flag sounds zero, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
by having a whole mesh of them, they said that like millions of people, right? And so a computer, you have like billions and millions of transistors and gates and whatever. And so anyway, they're trying to show like the army was able to kind of put this together and like get all these people working, doing very simple jobs, but together to do the calculations to kind of determine when the stable and chaotic errors are going to happen.
Okay, so that's like a very fundamental aspect of like how computers work.
Yeah. It's a very
Okay.
like super low level of like how computers work, and so that's the kind of stuff like if you went to school for computer science or any kind of electrical engineering or anything that's just electronics, like you'll learn that stuff. So that stuff resonated with me because like I did study that stuff. It's like, oh, I remember like AND gates and OR gates and whatever. So
Oh, I see. Yeah. So like my husband is also his career started off as like a programmer. He has his degree is also in computer science, and like that's where we lose each other,
wow.
Like when like I don't understand like what he does. I don't
Yeah.
understand it. And it's just as well because like I appreciate it, but I don't understand it. And when I was reading that part about the computers, I guess I wasn't geeking out over the computer aspect, but more so like thinking about how like I guess this is how like now in hindsight actually I'm thinking about how like this is how the Trisolarans work in like what we were talking about earlier with the collective versus like the individual
Yeah.
units. So that's probably how their civilization must communicate with each other, right?
Yeah, they mentioned actually later on that like the Trisolarans like they communicate with like their thoughts directly, and that's a big part of the second book too. But like they communicate like with their brain waves directly, and
Mm-hmm.
so they're saying like, well, most of the stuff in the three body game is made up, but the computer thing is actually real. They actually did that, so that's a pretty interesting
Right.
thing. So I would say if like if your husband's also a computer scientist and you're trying to get him in to read the books, just show him that chapter. It's like, all right, just read this one chapter, then maybe he'll get into it then.
Oh, that's a good idea because like that wasn't even one of the more memorable parts for me. Like I was like, oh, whatever. This is just like what. Whereas the game, I was very fascinated by the game because it was such a case study in how like indoctrination works
Hmm.
and like how you can get someone to believe in a certain thing. It's like this like I always think about like how shady like multi-level marketing schemes are
Yeah.
and how they like get you thinking about like one thing at first and then they like build so many levels upon that.
Right.
And I was like, "Oh wow, like So the Trisolarans are terrible at strategy, but they're great at this, like, trying to, feed their entire, like, civilization or knowledge of their civilization into humans as like almost like this culty religion-y thing. I don't know how much of that strategy came actually directly from them, or once they teamed up with like the ETO and realized that there are people who are willing to be indoctrinated this way.
Yeah, I think
That they kind of, it was like a team effort where the humans kind of told them like, this is how we work and this is how you can manipulate us. And they're like, oh, that's
yeah.
what we'll do.
Yeah, because like those people, the ETO eventually like end up worshiping the Trisolarans, right? And so like they want to prophesize their religion, right? They want to show other people like the how great the Trisolarans are, and so like there's probably more technical minded people who are good at like multi-level marketing and those kind of things, and saying like, all right, we can make a game to recruit people. Yeah, it took me a while to understand there was actually a recruiting tool. Like like the first couple of times I went to the Three Body World, I thought it was just like, oh, this is what the book's going to be. It's going to be talking about this cool game, right?
Yeah, it was really interesting how like it was like all these puzzle pieces with like this weird imprint thing that's happening
yeah,
on the retinas of like, Wang Miao, and then all these other people start like seeing things, and then like what does this have to do with the computer game, and
right.
how it all comes together in the end. And it's like, oh, like it's like almost like you're seeing like little snapshots of what's happening, but then collectively it all does make sense. And I've
Yeah,
seen a lot of like shows and books and stuff that try to create these little scenarios that are supposed to come together at the end, but they don't quite come together as nicely.
right.
But it was
Yeah.
like really nice to see in this that it does actually come together pretty nicely.
Yeah, when I was telling my friends about this book, like, yeah, I would say like the first book, like all the mysteries they set up, they answer them right in a very satisfying way. It's not like
Yeah,
you're not going
like
to
the
be like
payoff
left.
at
Yeah,
the end of something like that has to be good.
yeah, yeah, and like it's hard to say it's plausible, but it's like it's understandable. That like obviously it's not plausible that you can unfold a proton into 11 dimensions or whatever, but
Right.
like you can say like, all right, well, it's that is the way they did it. I kind of get it, but it's like an interesting way to kind of think about like how they would have manipulated people to end up like kind of worshiping them, and not they didn't do it directly even like that is people I think are just open to those kind of things, right?
Right, because I often wonder, because I it's like a hobby of mine to watch like cult shows.
Mm.
Not really, but I've watched a few and I've come across a few multi-level marketing schemes, and I always think like, how do these people fall for this stuff?
Right.
And then it just seems like some people just have this mindset where they will very, very readily welcome this into their lives.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the job of the person who's like orchestrating all of this is to identify those people really well. And it's just like really interesting how that all came together. And of course, like computer games is a really good strategy for that, because like we all know that like gamers get like super into their games, right?
Right.
Where like it becomes like the line between reality and game starts to blur. And of course this is further exacerbated by the fact this is like VR type of game. So it was like kind of like brilliant. Like of course, like that's how they would gather sympathists for the Trisolarans.
Anything else you want to talk about?
No, it was just, this was really fun to talk about. I feel like I was finally able to like put word to all the thoughts that I was having after reading the books, because it's like you don't really think about it until like you read a book that's like really makes an impression on you, and then you're like, oh well, how will, and I almost get like afraid to like launch into like another book because it's almost like, well, how is this going to top that? Like it's not.
Right.
So yeah, it helps to have these conversations, and I think this podcast will probably be even more like, I hope you continue it after the show series comes out, because that'll be a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah, that was always my intention, was to finish the books in time for the show to come out, so we can then talk about the show once it's out.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. Because that's what we used to do with Game of Thrones. Like every
Right.
episode, we'd listen to a podcast about it afterwards.
Same. Yeah, that's basically how I got my idea to do it, because I love those kind of like rewatch or watch along kind of podcast series. So that's why I wanted to do something similar for another series that I didn't see another podcast that does something similar. So I thought it would be kind of a good way to get in early before it probably becomes pretty popular, right? I would imagine if it's like a Benioff and Weiss series on Netflix, and it's going to be big. So maybe we can get on the front floor.
Yeah, and people are going to turn to podcasts a lot then.
Yeah, especially in these complicated concepts and themes. So hopefully people will find us and listen. So I really appreciate talking to you. It's been a great time.
Same. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks. And thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to participate in this series, please leave comments, emailing us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter @rehydratepod. Thanks.